Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Public Financing of Transmission, Building Lines and Reducing Ratepayer Impacts in States. Really happy with the level of interest that you all and many have had in this topic. My name is Jeremy Tarr, and I'm the U.S. State Policy Director here at Clean Air Task Force. CATF is a nonprofit organization working globally to catalyze the rapid development and deployment of clean energy. We bring 30 years of policy expertise and operate as a pragmatic advocacy group with a presence across the U.S. and internationally. CATF's state advocacy leverages the deep technical and policy expertise that CATF is known for and provides timely, fact-based education, analysis, and insights to advance climate and clean energy solutions across the country. This is the second of our 2026 state webinar series. And in case you missed it, in February, Clean Air Task Force, NRDC, CEN, and Rewiring America presented our 2026 outlooks for state policy. Other previous webinars have covered topics such as 2025 winds and trends, low emission industrial policy, fusion energy, and clean electricity standards. I am thrilled to be joined today by Anya Poplavska at Acadia Center, who CATF has partnered with to produce our forthcoming reports on public financing in New England, and you will hear about. I'll pass over to Anya in a second, but before I do so, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website and emailed to you afterward. We'll also email you today's slides. We welcome audience questions. Thank you to some of you who submitted some when you registered for this webinar, but we'll also have a Q&A portion at the end. So if you still have a question or one comes up and you'd like to ask one, just go ahead and submit it using the Q&A function and we will get to it. With that, thanks again for being here, and Anya, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Just going to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Anya Poplavska. I'm a senior policy advocate at Acadia Center. Acadia Center is a Maine-based nonprofit working in the Northeast region. We have over 20 years of climate and clean energy experience regionally, and transmission is certainly our bread and butter as well when it comes to engaging in these topics. So very, very excited to be discussing that with all of you today. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Nicole, I believe, for more intros.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Nicole Pavia. I lead our Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment Program here at Clean Air Task Force, where we focus on identifying and overcoming barriers to deploying infrastructure at the pace and scale we need to decarbonize. I'm also joined by my colleague, Kelsey Landau, who you'll hear from a little bit later on. And we're really excited to tell you a little bit more about our work on the public financing topic and our ongoing research into this emerging area. We'll also allude to this work throughout the presentation, but as Jeremy mentioned, we are about to release a report with Acadia Center exploring public financing in the New England states and across the New England region. So we're really excited for the publication of that, and we'll make sure all of you are on the distribution list. If you can go back to the agenda slide just for 1 second, thank you. So a quick preview of what we're going to be discussing today and how we'll run through the presentation. First, we will set the high-level scene. So why are we talking about the topic of public financing at all? We'll touch on affordability challenges that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with and hearing a lot about. And we'll also discuss how transmission plays a role in that conversation and how it factors in. Then, through the lens of our New England research and expertise that Anya brings, we'll provide some information on how public financing and partnerships with the private sector can help lower costs of transmission. And finally, we'll discuss how these public financing mechanisms can be implemented and some design features of public financing entities that are applicable across a wide range of states and regions. Next slide, please. So just to set up a little bit of context on the affordability challenge and our current infrastructure status quo. Nationwide, we know that to achieve a wide variety of goals, So whether you're interested in improving system reliability, resiliency, energy security, interconnectedness, carbon intensity of the grid, you name it, we're going to need to build a lot of infrastructure, and we're going to need to build it relatively quickly. To give you a quick sense of the scale of infrastructure deployment that we're talking about, nationwide studies have found the need to replace the entire grid, for example, triple existing grid capacity, increase generation capacity, and other energy resources by amounts never before seen in the history of our energy system. So this is a really, really big ask. However, over the past couple of years, and after several of these really big national studies were completed, projecting out, build to 2050, we're experiencing another fundamental underlying shift in our energy system. Thanks to data center deployment, onshoring of manufacturing, electrification of various end uses, and a few other things, electricity demand is growing significantly for the first time in decades. And over the past 3 years alone, as you can see on the right-hand side, FERC, our federal energy regulator, has readjusted its demand growth forecasts out to 2030 on an annual basis. So this is quite unusual. We usually see projections remaining pretty steady over time, but FERC has thought it necessary to go back and revise its projections over the past few years. And projections are now 7 times what was initially predicted in 2022. That only took a few years. So we're really talking about a very seismic shift here. And we don't know exactly how much of this demand growth will materialize, but when we look at the infrastructure demands projected to get to net zero, and then the demand projections and updates, one thing is for sure, our infrastructure needs are growing, and they're growing really, really fast. Next slide, please. So now, just as unprecedented amounts of infrastructure investment is needed to meet and prepare for these demand growth projections, policymakers, regulators, consumer advocates, and other key stakeholders are faced with another immediately pressing issue. In most places around the country, electricity rates are rising, even when compared to inflation. So this visual on this slide, you can see it's just a snapshot in time, and it's over 2024 to 2025, so it's already a little bit out of date. But it just shows you the change in, or the consumer price index, which is kind of a stand-in for inflation, and then the increases experienced in rates in different parts of the country and in different states across the country. And you can see that it's indicative of how prices for really everything is going up, but prices for energy are going up in most places even more than that. The Energy Information Agency reported that average retail electricity rates have risen by more than 5% even in the last year alone. So when people are paying more for everything, and in most places paying more than they might expect to pay for electricity, it gets harder and harder to say we need to spend more to build on infrastructure, and that can erode social license for the energy transition. So we noted that we'll need investment across every part of the energy system, generation, distribution, production, you name it, to meet goals and standards for our energy system going forward. Let's zoom in and take a closer look at the grid itself to introduce some of the baseline challenges we'll be talking about in this presentation and in our reports. So first, though we've stated we need more investment in the grid generally, it's not like we haven't been spending money on transmission. You can see from this slide here that transmission spending over the past 20 years or so has nearly tripled. But where is this investment being focused, and where is it maybe being less focused that deserves a little bit more attention? So today we're seeing a lot of spending focusing on maintaining the basic effectiveness of the grid, basic reliability of the grid. And these costs, though they're very necessary, of course, to maintain our grid, they continue to go up due to inflation, supply chain challenges, and other really sometimes global issues outside of a lot of folks' control. However, we see that bigger challenges on the grid continue to go unaddressed. So one example of this is we have a note on the slide of the grid congestion. Grid congestion is just a fancy word for saying that there are pockets of electricity in certain regions that are produced very cheaply, and maybe electricity prices there are low. And then there are other regions on the grid where electricity prices are really high because there might be, constraints on the grid. And there's a lack of wires available to bring that cheap electricity to the more expensive regions. So we call these like artificially high price pockets. And this is very, very common on our grid today, unfortunately. So that what that means in reality is that, though we're spending money on upgrades, new wires that we need to connect regions are not being built in the right places, and cheap electricity is kind of getting stuck. So that's just one metric that we look at when we think about, how we're spending money on the grid. And as we'll get into more throughout the presentation, many of these transmission investments, whether they're upgrade projects or new projects, are big capital expenses that at the end of the day trickle down into rates that homes and businesses have to pay for. So to kind of put the bigger picture all together, customers are already seeing increasing electricity bills. Routine upgrades and costs to maintain the system are increasing, and we still need a lot of new transmission to unlock cheaper electricity around the country. So without innovation and more new ways of thinking about planning and financing infrastructure, there's the risk that the entirety of this new investment bucket will fall onto ratepayers. And at the same time, that investment could still not be optimized to the way that we would like. So with that scene setting, I will pass it along to Anya to provide a little more nuance in the investment outlook in New England, what's driving costs there, and what some innovative, mechanisms we looked at together. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. As Nicole mentioned, she set a really important scene on kind of talking about the nationwide issue with rising costs. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And as Nicole also mentioned, CATF and Acadia Center have been working on a transmission study focused on New England. But what I do want to emphasize for folks who might be listening that are not part of the New England region, bear with me because we're going to be talking about New England as a case study, but lots of this has a lot of nationwide applicability. Now on this slide, we can even just kind of look at the bottom part to Nicole's earlier point, transmission costs. We have been spending money on transmission. These costs are rising nationwide, not just in New England. We see that utility spending has increased almost 50% over the last 5 years, and billions of those costs are tied to transmission. Now, New England is really interesting in the sense that our transmission costs, aside from California or the CAISO region, are significantly higher than other grid operators. So we've seen data that the projected extra costs for transmission by 2050 are going to be $16 to $26 billion. A lot of that has to do that in our region. There's a projected doubling of demand by 2050. So, a lot of this demand's increasing. That obviously triggers higher costs, right? And we can see on the right-hand side here, this is for New England specifically, we see that transmission makes up about a third of wholesale energy costs. So that is a really, really massive sum when you think about it. And compared to other grid regions, essentially transmission is really taking up a large share. We can go to the next slide. So this really begs the question of, we're talking about cost, transmission, and really digging into why is this the case? And again, some of this New England specific, but we really see similar issues across regions. So some of that really just first, plainly, inflation, supply chain cost issues, aging infrastructure. I mean, the grid itself is really fascinating on the concept of aging infrastructure because we have poles, wires, infrastructure that's 50, 60, 70, sometimes even 70 years, sometimes even older than that, right? So we're really dealing with having to keep up the grid to the current pace of what we need technologically and time-wise. And in the last slide, I had mentioned that in the last 5 years, costs have gone up a lot. I mean, the last 5 years or so is from 2020 onwards, right? So it's no surprise that supply chain issues and inflation have been a huge issue in the last 5 years or so. And that affects, every region of the economy, transmission included, right? So the second factor, though, that we should look into, and again, this applies for multiple parts of the country and really just nationwide, is this concept of the lack of scrutiny in financial processes, or also what some people have colloquially referred to as a regulatory gap. So just like in other parts of grid build out, there really is an incentive for utilities and transmission owners to really build, and they earn a rate of return on the more build out that they do. And therefore that means more returns for their shareholders. So we see this issue on the distribution level and the transmission level. there's what's called a formula rate process at FERC, and essentially this is the approval process through which transmission projects get their revenue returns. And we can see on this slide here, Acadia Center, so our organization and other organizations actually challenged in the New England area some of these returns that transmission owners were getting. And this was over a decade-long challenge. And we just found out it was successful. And so transmission owners need to return a collective $1.5 billion to ratepayers. I mean, that alone just shows that these approval processes going on at the federal level, where there might be a bit of cushy or extra approval that transmission owners are getting, that maybe there's not enough interveners in these proceedings, or there's just other reasons why some of this might be getting swept under the rug. There's like a lack of capacity to really evaluate all of this thoroughly. So this alone indicates a huge issue in transmission spending. And the last section of this slide, and a key factor we'll talk about, is this concept of lack of coordinated planning. Now, of course, we want to give a lot of credit to grid operators in these different grid regions that do invest a lot of time and effort into making sure that transmission systems run smoothly and energy markets run smoothly, right? But generally speaking, we've seen a trend of a lack of comprehensive planning that instead focuses on kind of putting out a fire one step at a time, a more piecemeal reliability focused approach when it comes to replacing infrastructure and spending. So for instance, in the New England region, we have what are called asset condition projects, which are projects focused on reliability, where you essentially focus on the replace or rebuild of existing infrastructure. Now, if you think about it, that means you're taking pieces of infrastructure piece by piece, right, and trying to replace it as you go along, which is a lot less efficient than looking at the system holistically and creating more forward-thinking investments, more encompassing investments that save money for ratepayers in the long run. And these are costs that rack up. I mean, we see on this slide, it's been almost $3 billion. We have almost $3 billion of these costs that we need to consider. And I mean, this is a massive amount that really needs to be regulated and coordinated better with other investments. We go to the next slide, please. And this right here, I mentioned, right, the formula rate process. Essentially, how do you recover revenue if you're building a transmission project and you want to get solid returns? So if you actually want to break down what comes into transmission costs and this approval of what's called the revenue requirement, we can look here on the left-hand side. So we have a large chunk of the return, what's called a return on the rate base, and essentially this return encompasses two things: the cost of debt and equity. We have a return on equity and the debt aspect of it, right? So debt and equity, you guys might have heard of these terms, right, when it comes to financial projects. Your financial split of a lot of projects is dependent on how much of each of these kind of factor you're considering. So debt, really, there's public and private debt, and this really just means loans that you get paid back with interest. And return on equity in this specific case, there's also private and public equity, but in this case, we talk about return on equity as private equity and returns to shareholders. So shareholders have invested a stake in your project, and you need to answer to them through returns, right? So these very important financial pieces make up a majority of this revenue requirement. Then we have depreciation. So how much do assets depreciate? This is pretty typical in financial scenarios, not just transmission, of course. Operation and maintaining of equipment, and then income taxes. So all these things together really make up this pie chart. Next slide, please. So it kind of begs the question, right? We've outlined some of the key factors of why costs are rising. We see what goes into how these costs kind of get recuperated. So it begs the question, what can we do to really tackle these challenges and analyze and improve our financial models? So the first is looking into joint public-private ownership. So instead of just having a project be fully publicly owned or fully privately owned, for instance, a huge benefit of public involvement or public ownership of projects is they don't have the same tax requirements or the same kind of borrowing costs that private entities do. So you could kind of creatively design projects where you have private involvement in the parts of the project that make sense, but then you kind of can bring in the public sector to lower costs at other parts of the project that are more advantageous. Another example we see is competitive project procurements. This is pretty intuitive, right? If you open up your project to more competitors, ideally, right, you have more efficiency and creativity, and it also goes into how you evaluate and choose your procurement, right? You can For instance, like for public financing, something we've been investigating is, could you run a procurement where states work together and they include public financing as part of that procurement, right? Like that is really strategic. The next thing, I kind of alluded to this before, right? Substituting private debt with public debt. The difference between private and public debt is really kind of where are you getting the loans that you're gathering, right? Are you going to private markets, or are you working with are we talking about public debt issued by government bodies, state, federal, local levels, right? So the benefit of public debt is that there's lower interest, you have higher credit ratings, and you really have a lot less of the taxes that you have to pay. You're able to issue tax-free bonds. And remember that pie chart we saw with the taxes making up a large part, right? So that's a very clear way to just cut costs. And the last part of the slide here is replacing higher cost equity with lower cost debt. So again, it really just goes to that debt equity split. As you guys can see, so much of the financial kind of entangling really just has to do with what percent each makes up. So you can modify your capital structure and decrease the equity part, which is a lot of the shareholder returns, and increase the debt, again, with involvement of the public sector, and you get all these benefits like tax-free bonds, lower interest, and things of that nature that eventually gets returned back to all of us, ratepayers. So we can go to the next slide, and with that, I'm going to pass it to Kelsey.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anya. So I'm going to spend a little time discussing several different implementation options for states who are interested in exploring public financing for transmission and the way that these levers that Anya just outlined can actually be pulled. Next slide, please. Implementation pathways can, of course, vary depending on transmission markets, the scope of institutional authorities of existing institutions in a given jurisdiction, and a range of other jurisdiction-specific dynamics. But they typically have a core set of design features, which can be operationalized either through expanding the authorities of an existing institution or through creating a wholly new institution. So either way, no matter the mechanism that a given state prefers, public financing institutions should have a clear statutory mandate providing them with the authority to develop or sponsor for jurisdictional transmission lines. These entities should have standalone revenue bonding authority, where the bond is repaid from project revenues. They should have the ability to build, co-own, or partner with utilities and independent power producers. There should be some sort of governance structures designed to hold them accountable to state government while simultaneously providing operational independence, whether that's a reporting requirement to the legislature, various board compositions where the board is appointed by the legislature, board members are appointed by the legislature or the governor, some combination thereof. And then these public financing mechanisms should be linked to RTO and ISO planning processes or to state procurements tied to state policy goals where those things exist. So we'll dive into a couple examples, starting on the next slide, please, with California, which is a very recent example. So like I said, there's states that have both expanded existing institutions and states that have created new ones. In its most recent legislative session just this past year, California opted for the former approach, passing SB 254, which created the California Transmission Infrastructure Accelerator, which has an explicit mandate to facilitate transmission public-private partnerships. So during the session, legislators in California assessed a range of different implementation pathways for public financing, including they discussed whether to start with a pilot project or a set of pilot projects before diving in. They ultimately decided to expand the authority of an existing entity, which is the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GOBIZ, which the accelerator is housed in, rather than creating a new institution from scratch. And they did so for a few different reasons. There was a concern that if they did a pilot project or set of pilot projects, it would just be sort of a one-off that would be like a few project-specific lines, but wouldn't establish sort of ongoing processes or state capacity, and they wanted to put these processes in place. And then very importantly, in California, there's a number of state and quasi-state entities that are already involved in transmission development. There's CAISO, there's the California Public Utilities Commission, there's the California Energy Commission, et cetera. And so there, the value of creating a wholly new institution was a bit unclear. So what they opted for instead was all of these existing entities are involved in the accelerator, and the accelerator coordinates among these institutions. So it also contains each of the design features that were noted on the previous slide. So like I said, it's housed within the existing Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, GOBIZ. It authorizes the California Infrastructure Bank to issue bonds for eligible projects. It selects qualifying projects, which are high voltage, competitively solicited CAISO projects, and then develops a public-private partnership plan to maximize debt financing for those projects, and it reports annually to the legislature for that accountability. Next slide, please. And all of this effort in California was driven by research by CATF with Net Zero California that showed that there were up to 57% savings on transmission development in California via a public-private partnership model compared to the traditional investor-owned utility financing model. So that's potential for very significant cost savings that California now has the potential to realize. Next slide, please. So I also just want to spend a few minutes of illustrative examples of existing institutions in New England that currently exist, but their authorities would require tweaking to finance large-scale transmission infrastructure. But doing this could certainly be an option if states are interested. And these are New England-specific institutions, but they're analogous entities to these in states around the country. So start with Mass Development. This is a statewide economic development finance agency and land bank in Massachusetts. It's authorized to issue bonds already, make loans, and financially support qualifying projects. It has significant existing institutional capacity around financing large-scale projects with expert staff that do this kind of thing all of the time. So that's certainly a plus. Currently, its mission statutorily is framed narrowly around promoting in-state economic development. So if it were going to finance and potentially co-own high voltage transmission facilities, especially those that are regional and not specific to the state of Massachusetts, it would likely need explicit legislative direction authorizing them to do so. So that is one potential existing institution whose authorities could be expanded. Another is the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, which also has broad powers to administer financing programs, borrow money, issue bonds, and pledge revenues. But its financing authorities are generally limited in size, with projects in the millions to tens of millions range, and again, are focused within Rhode Island. And so it would need to be sort of significantly expanded and retooled to finance or co-finance transmission infrastructure. But again, that it could potentially be an option. So there are analogous, of course, economic development agencies, infrastructure banks, green banks, and other relevant entities, including state and municipal public power authorities. So New York Power Authority, the Massachusetts Municipal Wholesale Electric Company, or MWEC. These are all institutions that already exist. They're in states around the country, and they could potentially serve as viable public financing mechanisms with various tweaks. Next slide, please. All right, so then another option, rather than repurposing an existing entity, is to create a new purpose-built entity for transmission public financing. And these are known as transmission authorities. And transmission authorities are independent state agencies that facilitate the siting, permitting, and financing of both new transmission lines and transmission upgrades. The first one was New Mexico's Renewable Energy Transmission Authority, New Mexico RETA, was founded in 2007. It was followed by CETA, the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, in 2021. And just last month, the WETA, the Washington Electric Transmission Authority in Washington State. And so you're seeing a trend where states are increasingly becoming interested in transmission authorities and exploring them, with bills to create them currently pending in Oregon, Montana, and Maine. So we expect to see more of that going forward as transmission continues to take center stage at the state level. So RETA, CETA, and WETA each have slight nuances in terms of their authorities, board composition, and so on. But broadly speaking, all of them have the power to enter into public-private partnerships, to facilitate local siting and permitting, to issue revenue bonds to finance development and construction, and to use eminent domain to acquire rights of way for needed transmission. And each of those things enhance their value add for partnerships with transmission developers. I'll also just note, this is not a statutory authority, but transmission authorities can also be really helpful in creating transmission expertise and central coordination capacity within the state government, which does currently exist in some states, but doesn't in others. And where that capacity doesn't really exist at the moment, transmission authorities can help play like a really important central expertise and coordination role within government. And so that is another option that we're seeing get increasing interest at the state level. And with that, I will turn it back to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Kelsey and Anya, for your presentations. And we're reaching the end of our formal presentation now. I just wanted to share a few CATF and Acadia Center resources that you might be interested in checking out on transmission and public financing. Acadia does a really amazing amount of work in the New England region, as you heard from Anya, and worked with our actually one of our consultants on this project, Power Advisory, to create a Canada and Northeast U.S. interregional transmission planning roadmap to tie into the need for better transmission planning. We also share a mutual interest in community benefits agreements, particularly for transmission. So, how do we quantify and share the benefits of building this infrastructure with communities? And Acadia put out a really formative study on that. CATF and Acadia have also partnered before. We've had the privilege of working together in the past on a report called The Energy is About to Shift, where we looked at a few different models and analyses of deployment of infrastructure in the New England region and identified some community-oriented ways to get there. CATF also has conducted a number of analyses on public financing, like Kelsey mentioned, our California report, which we did with Net Zero California, staff at UC Berkeley, and other partners called Wired for Savings. You can see that on our website and check out the savings that could potentially accrue to ratepayers in California, and we'll see how the accelerator that Kelsey mentioned pans out. We also have been working closely with the Colorado Transmission Authority to help socialize what they can provide to developers and partnership opportunities for developers, both in terms of supporting their projects, but also providing public financing in the form of revenue bonding authority. And another point to make about a lot of these entities, it's really important to staff them and make sure that any entity that can offer public financing has sufficient staffing to work really closely with partners and developers. And one other piece I wanted to mention is we have a kind of broad look at transmission authorities, which is noted on the right-hand side here. So please check out both of our websites for more information on any of these topics. And next slide, please. I'll just wrap up to plug once again our public financing report in the New England region together with Power Advisory, Professor Josh Macy at Yale Law School, Acadia Center, and CATF. We are really excited for this report to launch. We are aiming for a mid-May launch and a webinar to share findings from the report soon thereafter. So we'll make sure that everyone is on the distribution list for that. And we have a few analyses in there, an economic analysis, which really digs into the nitty-gritty of what pulling each of these levers looks like in New England. We have a legal analysis also and an institutional analysis that Power Advisory and Josh Macy worked on, which shows, how do we actually implement in New England? We wanted to take advantage of the existing collaboration that has gone on in the New England region. States have collaborated on, GRIP funding together. They've created the longer term transmission planning process, which is a huge undertaking. So we looked at ways in which public financing could be potentially integrated into that. I won't give too much away because we have not published yet, but we did find savings in the billions in the New England region, both across new builds and asset condition projects. So we're really, really excited for that to come out, and we'll keep you all updated. And with that, that concludes our formal presentation. We thank you all so much for your attention and for joining us here today. It's a real pleasure to share our research and work with you. And now I'll pass it over to Jeremy. Thank you.
All right, so let's move to the Q&A session of the webinar. We have gotten some questions in. Reminder, if you have any questions, just put them in there. You don't need to overthink it. We'll kind of answer them in conversation style. Yes, we will share links to the resources that Nicole mentioned on slide 21. So that'll be forthcoming when we share with you the link to this video, and we'll send a slide deck to everyone that registered. So definitely forthcoming. All right, first question. How does the Velco ownership model fit into the concepts being discussed today? Let me just open the floor if one of you want to take that.
Yeah, I can give first stab at it if folks are okay with that. Yeah, I think caveat with the fact that none of us on this call are necessarily Velco experts, but I think Velco is definitely a unique entity because I think it's the only one in the nation that has a model like that. And my understanding is Velco operates basically like a mini grid operator for Vermont, and they kind of function like a publicly owned utility. And they do also have a bonding authority, and they release a transmission plan and all these things. So I would say that we are definitely in support of different types of models as long as you're saving costs for ratepayers, you're doing smart transmission, and you're doing smart transmission planning. So as mentioned in our presentation, we see different models like in Colorado, like New Mexico. You also see NYPA, which does transmission bond issuing and, is involved in transmission, but also renewables projects. So I think at the end of the day, public financing can fit almost like a puzzle piece in any different kind of way that you want to design an organization. And I don't think there's any one right answer. As long what Velco is doing is great because it's publicly owned. They also issue bonds, and we can develop kind of like different models depending on what region you're looking at. So
Thanks, Anya. Nicole, or maybe I'm not sure who this one, but good question about just an ask to elaborate on the types of bonds that these different examples are kind of referencing when it comes to public bonding authority.
Yeah, I can start, Anya, and please feel free to weigh in. So we looked in this example at revenue bonding authorities, which basically means that the bond is backed by potential revenues from the project. So that, some benefits of that are that the state is kind of not on the hook and taxpayers are not on the hook for, if a project goes under or something like that. The financing is quite protected in that way. We do see other, examples or options for public financing that we didn't necessarily look at for this report, but in other contexts might be of interest depending on how, risk averse or risk taking your jurisdiction is. So there are other bonds called government obligation bonds. Those do put the full faith and credit of the state behind a project. And while, for example, California, their accelerator and the system that they have set up right now is using revenue bonds, but they are investigating the potential to also leverage, in some cases, government obligation bonds. So we'll see. This is an evolving topic, an emerging topic, like we've been discussing. So we'll see, how big of a role government obligation bonds end up playing in any of these build outs. Right now, though, the focus is mostly on revenue bonding authority for the most part.
And anything more to share on like the trade-offs, pro cons between the revenue bonding and the project revenue bonds? You spoke a little bit to this, I think, just now, Nicole, by talking about the revenue bonding kind of where the project revenue is paying back the financing on the bonds, and so that protects ratepayers. But any other thoughts on those two different options?
Yeah, I do think that is the main benefit is that basically in a revenue bonding scenario, if the project does not generate revenue or make money, then, the then basically like no one publicly, no ratepayers are liable for that project, failing or the need to pay back that bond. Whereas, if you have a state that's providing bonding for a particular project and they're putting the full faith and credit of the state behind that, then if a project falls through, that could theoretically go back onto taxpayers. I don't think it would necessarily be ratepayers. It would usually be taxpayers. So it's just a little bit of a risk assessment. And right now, it feels like a more cautious and responsible approach that a lot of states are taking is the revenue bonding route.
Yeah, I'll just add on that real quick. I think states have many different states and municipalities, anyone with bonding authority, tend to have many different demands on their general obligation bond financing abilities. These bonds are used for many different things outside of the energy world as well. And so it can be sort of a tougher political ask to repurpose some of that bonding authority for geo bonds for transmission, which is sort of, a newer area for many governments to be delving into. Whereas because revenue bonds are backed by the project specifically, they're a little bit more insulated and it may be more politically palatable and feasible for governments to pursue as well.
All right, next question. This is for you, Anya. Could you talk about the practical steps that can be or need to be taken to actualize public financing in states?
yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Absolutely. Certainly, it's a question of political will and the type of public financing structure you are trying to enable. So for instance, we see right now in Maine this session, there was a study bill proposed on the concept of public financing. So that's a great first step, and that's an example of how you would typically, go through the legislative process in different states in order to create some sort of legislative enablement to stand up a new public financing authority. However, if you want to change an existing agency's statutory authority, that will still take like a level of statutory enablement and changing of the rules and regulations of that authority to expand what it can do. But that might be, for instance, a bit of a simpler route than having to stand up an entirely new entity and go through the legislative, haggling, especially across different states, in order to make that happen. So for instance, the California research that CATF worked on actually resulted in a bill being passed the next session, right? So we definitely see that depending on how strong the political will is, in California, for instance, with all the wildfires and natural disasters, utilities are maybe open to new sources of capital and new experimentation. That may not be true for other regions. So it's certainly a large amalgamation of factors, but it's very fair to say that the next step is to go to the legislature and build political feasibility for this.
I'll have questions continuing to come in. So I'm going to put two together to ask. You may have already covered this, Nicole, but are there examples of like ratepayer-backed bonds? Is that a thing? And then you mentioned maybe tax base could be implicated in some cases. And then the related one is just if you could compare interest rates and maybe other types of costs of different types of debt financing. So like project revenue, government obligation, investor-owned utilities. Any numbers you can put, roughly to those different types of financing models.
Ratepayer-backed bonds. I'm not sure actually if that exists. We can look into that unless my colleagues know of anything like that, but okay, quick look at them. Doesn't look that way. And then in terms of, I could speak at a high level to the interest rates for different types of financing, because I think that it does vary across the states and jurisdictions and entities that you're working with. I think like at a high level, typically private debt is going to have higher rates than a public option might. And so that is why, replacing some higher interest rate or higher interest rate debt and higher debt financing from the private sector with more public options can lead to decreases in costs leading from that. So in terms of actual numbers, I'm not 100% sure, but I would maybe say, just given the options, probably government obligation, because as the state continues to get more involved in things, the risk profile for a bond tends to go down, so that would likely have a lower interest rate. And then probably revenue bond, and then on the other side, your more typical private debt leveraged by investor-owned utilities. But that's a very general answer. But every jurisdiction, I think, looks a little bit different. Depends on who the players are. And our studies also have all of the assumptions that we use to assess the mathematics behind all of this in them. So I would direct everyone to that when the studies come out.
Awesome. Have you all seen any public opposition to public financing for transmission? If so, kind of what does that look like? And are there strategies to overcome any opposition to public financing?
This I think, is a great question. So I'll say a couple of high-level things. First, I think public financing and public entities being involved in transmission occurs when projects are difficult or interstate or international or are serving some type of public policy need in a state. And again, speaking at very high general levels. So I'm thinking about like, when New Mexico RETA gets involved as a partner on a project, for example. Something like the SunZia project comes to mind, which is a huge multi-state, like very complicated project. And the government entity in that case can help, facilitate the build out of the project. That doesn't mean that the project is not going to face opposition, as we as we all know from that case and many other cases of transmission build out. Often projects, face some type of community opposition, and that can be worked through various ways. But I think one kind of thing to say is that, you know, in some places throughout the country, if the state or a public entity is involved in a transmission line, it can kind of, help with buy-in a little bit and increase interest in the line. If it's serving a public, perceived public need, that's just a kind of qualitative thing that can be important to folks. One thing that we do look at also in our New England report is the potential, and I'm not sure if this has concretely happened yet in other places, but in New England, the potential for the savings from using some of these public financing mechanisms to be channeled into things like community benefits agreements or services for host communities or other, public policy needs that might arise in the region. So there is a pathway to connecting public financing and potentially serving some unmet needs of host communities. That's something that I think we would love to explore further in potential implementation strategies around public financing.
Question about whether there are financial instruments that can be used specifically to ensure environmental benefits. Maybe it's things like mitigation of harm or restoration. Yeah. So are there ways to like make sure to include environmental protection into the financing of projects?
Yeah, I can speak to this really quickly. This is certainly an adjacent topic, but basically bouncing off of what Nicole just said, community benefits agreements, especially for transmission, have historically been able to finance mitigation measures exactly like what you're describing, Conrad. So that is absolutely a process where the transmission developer, whoever is developing the project, should be meeting with the community and ensuring that there's spending going towards mitigating measures on top of the fact that there's NEPA, right? Depending where you're working, like in California, they have CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, where there's already so much, right, regulation and permitting that goes into these projects that should cover these topics, right, on top of the fact that community benefits agreements add even more. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'll just add that there's also sort of a policy question about like, what do you do with the savings from transmission public financing that we've discussed, right? And do you, if the state is involved and then it gets repaid, can it then use that money to finance sort of other programs? And so I think there is, a policy discussion to be had about, sort of linking the public financing savings to things like mitigation for that project or for community benefits for that project, or rate relief. I think there's a number of possibilities there. And that's ultimately a policy decision, but I think one that could definitely be discussed as part of a public financing mechanism.
Kelsey, this may be a good one for you. You spoke about different financing kind of models, new authorities, existing authorities, et cetera. But what are things that states, if they're considering public financing, that they should be thinking about? Are there factors, are there specific considerations that you'd encourage them to have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a key thing is what entities are currently structured in your states to enable these financing tools, right? Like I mentioned, economic development agencies, infrastructure banks, municipal public power, right? There's NYPA, right? If you want to go to state level public power, look at what is already existing and has financing capacity. And I think it's really worth considering. Is it possible to expand their authorities? What would be some of the pros of doing so? What are the drawbacks? Does your state have transmission expertise already at the state level that could be repurposed, or, driven toward a public financing role? If not, maybe a new institution like a transmission authority is a good way of, beginning to develop that expertise. And then, who is engaged in transmission overall? Is it an ISO in your state? Is it a state government, a balancing entity, multiple state agencies? All of these sort of existing factors can help shape sort of the structure of what public financing looks like. And then broadly, what are your policy goals? What are your other policy goals? Are you interested in public financing for just transmission? How about, energy generation? We're hearing more about that. Can these things be paired together? And so I think just being really clear on what are your goals and what institutions you have already in your state can help, clarify some of the thinking around that. And I'll just say we're very eager and happy to be a resource. So if you are in a state, whether one we talked about or a different one entirely, please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to bounce some ideas off of us, I think we'd be more than happy to do that.
Great. Is public financing only available for transmission, or can it be used for other things? Nicole, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Public financing can be applied to all kinds of not only energy infrastructure, but all kinds of infrastructure. There are many entities that NYPA has been mentioned several times now as an interesting example. The New York Power Authority in New York State, they provide public financing options and partnership options for transmission projects and also for renewables and other generation technologies. So this study, focuses on transmission. But there are many, many opportunities to explore public financing more broadly for generation going forward.
Maybe following up on that, can it be used for, I think you may have just said grid upgrades, but also asset condition projects, or just for greenfield development when it is used for transmission?
Yeah, thanks. So it can be used for both greenfield development and also upgrades and asset condition projects, as they're referred to in New England, but in other places they might be called reliability projects or reliability upgrades. In our study, actually, we looked at savings potential for both categories, so both greenfield projects and for asset condition projects, and found very significant savings across both. So yeah, as long as the entities are considering, a wide range of projects and thinking broadly about transmission as, new and upgraded projects, and thinking about bonding authorities for both of them, then that is definitely an option. And yeah, on the table for sure.
Got it. All right, can't get through a energy related webinar without using the word affordability. So could y'all maybe just articulate how you see this relating to affordability? Maybe obvious, but spell it out. And like, how much of a solution do you think this is for our affordability crisis?
Yeah, I can jump in to start and say, I mean, I definitely think this is a huge piece of the puzzle. There's so much momentum in this conversation. We really want to capitalize on that momentum and include this as one potential solution. The tricky thing with affordability when you talk about an energy, I mean, there's so many complex cost drivers that, we see a lot of states approaching us and having this kind of conversation of like, hey, can you give us a suite of solutions that we can apply? Because it's really not just one thing that's going to be a silver bullet. So in short, I would say that I think this would very much apply depending on what other solutions you're also looking at and the feasibility, right? So for instance, as we mentioned, if you maybe just edit an existing statute of an agency in a state that's already extremely politically favorable to this idea, that's going to be significantly easier than standing up a new entity between 6 states, for instance, right? It's completely going to depend, but it certainly has a lot of potential, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. Just to follow quickly, I completely agree that it's part of a broader suite of solutions. But just to go back to the kind of introduction that I laid out at the beginning, transmission and grid spending overall is a growing piece of our energy expenditure. We really have nationwide failed to invest in really efficient and sufficient transmission systems. And so now we're finding ourselves, needing to upgrade our existing system, but also build those really critical new lines. And so, as much as transmission is a pretty sizable piece of the energy expenditures nationwide right now, it's going to be an increasing piece. And so, that will, without innovation and intervention, just trickle back down into rates. So we're trying to be proactive and provide, one policy option that might be available to stakeholders who are interested in this topic.
All right, last call for questions. We have one more, which we'll do, and then we'll wrap up. But if you have a final question, please put it in the chat. We have a couple more minutes to answer questions if you have them. All right, Kelsey, let's go to you for this one. You talked about transmission authorities and, super interesting. Sounds like there's growing momentum in transmission authorities and states. They're fairly new, right? So like, do we have enough of a track record with them to be able to tell whether they're effective or, how they are actually effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are generally new. RITA has been around in New Mexico since 2007. So they're established and they I think have been quite successful and have partnered with, a range of transmission developers in New Mexico to get lines built. So I think Nicole mentioned SunZia earlier. They've, been instrumental in helping get that project across the finish line and I think have demonstrated their value to developers in the New Mexico region. Both for public financing, but then also their other authorities, things like siting assistance, the coordination capacity that they can provide, I think has been very useful in the Southwest. CETA in Colorado is the second most recent. It was founded in 2021 and it spent the last couple of years sort of getting off the ground, doing a lot of developer education, building capacity, getting policies up and running. And so I think is, just starting to hit its stride, now and going forward in terms of, looking for developers to partner with. I am optimistic that as, it sort of can become self-reinforcing where the more transmission authorities that exist, the more they can both like developers can be familiar and comfortable with them and look to them for partnerships and know what the value add that they can have is. And also that they can coordinate among each other and help build some interstate sort of regional transmission lines that are very needed as well. So I think it is early. I think there's some promising signs and hopefully like if and as these become real existing institutions in more states, it can become a bit of a self-reinforcing virtuous cycle.
Well, thank you all for your presentations and answering questions. Some great questions from folks. Appreciate everybody joining, and it's been really wonderful partnering with Acadia Center on this project. I know our leadership has worked together for decades, so just really great, Anya, to have you on this project and webinar. We're going to post a recording of the webinar in the next day or so. We'll email all of you a link to that and to the slides. If you have any questions or want to keep the discussion up on state climate action, transmission, any of the topics discussed here, please reach out to any of us at CATF or to Anya, our other friends at Acadia Center. And finally, please keep an eye out for our forthcoming report. And we'll have more webinars in 2026. Our next webinar is going to be in a couple of months. I think we're close to setting the date. Actually, I believe it's going to be at the end of May. And it's going to be focused on order books, particularly for nuclear energy, a hot topic. So we'll have some really good experts to just explain kind of the what and why and how of order books. With that, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Bye, everybody.